Chapter 4, Mishna Yud, Mishna 10. Today we will be completing Masechta Megillah, and the Mitzvah Shem tomorrow will be starting Moed Katan. Okay, so we learned previously how there was a practice of having a translation. That during the Torah reading, there was a Aramaic translation of what was being read. So this Mishnah is a continuation of that halacha. Mishnah Yud, Maisa Ruvain, the story of Ruvain, recorded in the Chumash, where it says, Ruvain went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, right, which was considered of course, a wrongful act on Ruvain's part. Nikra v'loy metargim. We read it, it's read, because the Torah has to be read in public. V'loy metargim, no translation done. Why is that? So it's interesting. First of all, it's important to know, that they bring down here in the notes, that we're going to, I can't wait till we get there. Another thing they bring down in the notes is the fact that the idea here of not translating it is to protect the honor of Ruvain. Now, protecting the honor of Ruvain, they explain here, is because of the fact that although the Torah says that sounds like Reuven actually laid with Bilhah, the Gemara says that's not what happened. The Gemara says that what happened is that after Rachel died, and Yaakov used to primarily have his bed in Rachel's tent, after Rachel died, he moved the bed into Bilhah's tent. Bilhah was the maidservant of Rachel. Reuven felt that was disrespectful to his mother Leah, and therefore he took Yaakov's bed and moved it into Leah's tent. That act of getting involved in his father's life was considered as if he had laid with his father's concubine Bilhah. But that's not really what happened. So therefore, although the Torah describes it that way because Reuven was wrong, was not correct for what he did, nonetheless, we're not gonna, for those who need the translation, okay, that don't understand Hebrew, for those that we don't have to go ahead and have to get into it with them in order not to disgrace Reuven. Okay, Masa Tamar, the story of Tamar. Now here, we are not talking about the story of Tamar and Yehuda, which is recorded in the Chumash. We're talking about the story of Tamar and Amnon, who were the children of David Amelech. They were not brother and sister. And this story is recorded in Shmuel Beis, the book of Samuel 2. And if you read that, the Mishnah is saying, if you read that for the Haftarah, Maisa Tamar, the story of Tamar and Amnon, where Amnon violated her, Nikra umatargem, it's read, and it is translated. It's translated. The story will be publicized. Now, is there such a Haftarah that we read with the story of Amnon and Tamar? No. The point is, though, that as they bring down here in the beginning of the notes, that in the times of the Mishnah, the weekly Haftarahs were not set. Rather, each congregation could select a passage to read as the Haftarah. We have a set order of the Haftarahs that we read. In the times of the Mishnah, they didn't. So therefore, if a congregation decided they're going to read this, if they're going to decide they're reading from this story from this section of the book of Shmuel, all right, so we say it's read and it's translated. Now it's interesting, right? For translating it, so this is not a very honorable story for David Amelech, for King David, that this happened amongst his family. Nonetheless, the Mishnah says we still translate it. We don't hold it back. Even though it is a certain level of disgrace to David, nonetheless, we do read that. Now, let's read a little bit further. That may help us get more understanding of this. Ma'aseh Egel Harishoin Nikra Umatargem. The first part of the story of the Egel is read and is translated. Okay? V'hasheni, but the second, let's call it the second section of the story of the Egel, Nikra v'loy metargem, is read and not translated. Let me explain what that means. What's the first story? What's the second story? So the way they're explaining is like this. The first story is where, the story in Parshas Kisisa, the story of the sin of the golden calf is where we have it. So they bring down here that from Pasuk, it's in chapter Lamed Beis, chapter 32. So from Psukim Aleph through Chaf, 1 through 20, that part of the story of the golden calf is read and is translated. Now, let me read you from the notes here. Although this story reflects badly on the Jewish people, reading it in public benefits them because the embarrassment caused by the reading helps to atone for their sin. That means, if I understand it correctly, is that although when you read the story of the sin of the golden calf, or like any other story in the Chumash, right? It is definitely reflects badly on the Jewish people, but the embarrassment caused by the reading, embarrassment to who? I wasn't there, you weren't there, but it seems to be the embarrassment to these past generations, right? It actually helps to atone for their sin. So therefore, we will read that story publicly, and not only read it publicly, we'll translate it. We'll even make sure for people who don't understand the Hebrew that they will hear that story because it helps them. Although it's an embarrassment, it atones for the sin. It could be just the same understanding as what we said before with the story of Amnon and Tamar. We're going to translate it, although it reflects it's embarrassing to David HaMelech, to King David, but nonetheless, this is something that whatever reason King David had to go through this kind of tragedy with Amnon and Tamar, publicizing it helps atone for whatever needs atonement. But what's the second part? The second part goes from, they bring down here, Sukkim Chav Aleph through Chav Hey, 21 to 25, and Pasuk Lamed Hey, verse 35. That's read and not translated. Since the second telling describes Aaron as being responsible for the golden calf, we do not translate it out of respect for him. Aaron gets extra respect. And therefore, the parts that directly pin it on him, directly kind of put where the blame is shared, where the Torah describes his responsibility for what happened, that we leave out. We're not going to translate it. We're going to read it, we don't translate it. Next, Birchas Kayanim, the blessings of the Kayanim. Now, this part of the Mishnah really goes back to what we just said, which is Nikra v'lo Mitargim. It's going to be read and it's not going to be translated. That means when you read Parashas Nasai and it comes to Birchas Kayanim, it's read but not translated. What's wrong with translating Birchas Kayanim? So they explain it like this. Because one of the lines that we say in Birchas Kayanim is Yisra Hashem panav elecha, which means, translated, may God show you his countenance. What that also implies, Yisra Hashem panav elecha, Hashem should lift his face to you, means he should show you favor. He should show you favor. Now, people will say, favoritism? God shows favoritism? God shows favoritism to the Jewish people? That doesn't sound right. Things should be straight and honest, so to speak. And really the Gemara tells us that there is a discussion where, between Hashem and the angels, where Hashem says, yeah, the Jewish people deserve my favoritism. Why? Because I tell them when they eat and they're satisfied after their meal, that's when they say Berachas Hamazon. That's when they say benching. That's when they say the grace after meals. What do? They say it even when they're not satisfied. They eat a kazayas, they eat a volume of an olive, the volume of an egg. So they're so beloved. They love serving me so much. I'm not going to show them favoritism. So yes, there is a concept of favoritism to the Jewish people. But there are people out there that can't handle it. They can't appreciate it. They can't handle it. And therefore, for certain people, again, this is the section of Berachas Kayanim. It's not the whole Berachas. I don't think it means the whole Berachas Kayanim. Let me just double check this to make sure. No, it sounds like the whole Berachas Kayanim. The whole Berachas Kayanim, although the whole section, all the brachas are not translated because of that bracha that people will not understand. Okay, next. Back to the story we mentioned before. Ma'aseh David v'Amnon. The story of David and Amnon, loy nikroyin, v'loy mitargemin. It's not read, nor is it translated. Now, we just said before the story of Tamar is read and translated. Mm-hmm. That's the same story of David and Amnon. Yeah. But what this means is that the verses in the story of David and Amnon that refer to Amnon as the son of David are not read or translated. Although this story referred to earlier as the story of Tamar may be read and translated, as Mishna taught above, these particular verses must be omitted out of respect for David. It's enough to say the story. To have to actually have his name, associated publicly with this, that far we respect David HaMelech and we don't even read it. Now again, because these are verses from the Tanakh, from Tanakh, either these are verses from the Nevi'im, right? It's not the words of the Torah itself. We don't have an obligation. We don't have to read the whole. We don't have to read. We have to read the whole Torah in shul. We don't have to read the whole books of the Nevi'im and Ksuvim. So therefore, if there's a section that we feel shouldn't be read, don't read it. Even if you're reading that section, that story, certain parts leave out. When it comes to things from the Torah, you can't leave them out. You have to read it. But we may not translate. There'll be situations where we choose not to translate it, or we're told not to translate it. Ein maftir b'merkava. The last thing the Mishnah says is that we do not read as part of the Haftarah the account of the chariot, which is the first chapter in the book of Yechezkel, the book of Ezekiel. It talks about, describes the chariot of Hashem. Mm-hmm. And what that means is it describes the vision of heaven experienced by the prophet Yechezkel is called Maisa Merkava, the account of the chariot, because it describes the angelic beings bearing the throne of Hashem like horses drawing a chariot. Okay, so we say, Ein maftirin, we do not read them in the Haftarah. Why is that? Because, as they explain here, upon hearing its mystical description of heaven, people might ask questions about it and seek to examine its secrets, which is inappropriate for all but the greatest scholars. Ma'aser Merkava is not meant to be learned in I don't want to word in depth, but it's not meant to be darshan. It's not meant to go ahead and be studied in a way that, to try to, there's only so much you can describe of it. You can describe what it says. You can get a picture of what it says, but to really try to understand it, it's too deep and mystical to understand it. And not only that, you're not supposed to publicly try to explain it. Rather, it's reserved for the greatest of scholars. And the way they describe that here is, the wisdom contained in this passage of such a secret nature that may not be taught to anyone explicitly. Rather, the teacher may give only its broad outline to a scholar who is perceptive enough to infer the details on his own. He must be pretty smart, right? Because the teacher knows just kind of like what to say. The student is going to be great enough to figure out the details, and that's how it's taught, not more. So what's the reason we don't read the Haftarah? Because if we read the Haftarah, then we're gonna then even, and it's interesting. It doesn't say read it and don't translate it. It says don't read it. Because if you read it, people are going to start hearing it and going to start wondering about it and asking questions about it and trying to get involved in things they shouldn't be. So leave it out. Rabbi Yehuda Matir, Rabbi Yehuda says no, you're allowed to read it, and we actually do read it. The first day of Shavuos, this is the Haftarah. And according to the way Rabbi Yehuda approaches it, his approach is that if the listener is a scholar, this comes from the Tosfos Yantif, he will realize that the meaning of these verses is beyond his understanding. He's going to understand this is beyond him. And if he is not a scholar, he will not ask anyone about it because he presumably knows that he is unworthy of being answered. So Rabbi Yehuda is not as concerned about any problems coming from it, and therefore he says you can read it as Haftarah. Rabbi Eliezer says, "Maftirin ein maftirin b'hodas Yerushalayim." We cannot read in the maftir the section of Hodas Yerushalayim, which means make known to Yerushalayim. This is in the book of Yechezkel, Ezekiel, Perek Tes Zayin, chapter 16, and the words in the Mishnah are just make known to Yerushalayim, but the rest of the words are all her abominations. That, Rabbi Eliezer says, we do not read that as a Haftarah because it speaks of the degradation of Yerushalayim. And therefore, out of respect to Yerushalayim, we do not read it. At the end of the day, Ein halach Rabbi Eliezer, the halach does not follow Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, so Mazel Tov, we have completed Masechta Megillah. Tomorrow we'll start Moed Katan. Have a wonderful day.